Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I'd like to welcome all of you to day 324 of Humanity Rising. Today, we're going to consider the very important issue of health and the environment. You'll note that it's day 324, which means that Humanity Rising, which originated last May 2020, as a response to the pandemic with a commitment to air initially 7 days a week, but now 5 days a week. The fact that we are now pushing past 300 days of a pandemic that many of us thought was going to be over in a few weeks or a few months, but we're now in the fourth and the fifth waves, is an indication of how powerfully the environment, in this case, a little virus, can affect our health. So we want today to delve into this relationship between health and the environment, knowing that since we're in code red, we're now in the climate tipping point, as we've been talking about for several months now on Humanity Rising. We're in a situation where the ecological, the environmental turbulence is now increasing in frequency and in lethality all around us. And there's nothing we can do to avoid it anymore. That's what it means to be in the tipping point. And in the face of that, our governments are less and less capable of maintaining stability and a public equilibrium. We see that all over the world, even now with COVID. Our governments, with all the science and technology available, can't even come up with a vaccine to ensure public health, because the virus is outsmarting us. And the environment will continue now to debilitate human capacities to maintain public order. I live in California. I see this all the time as fires rage right now. 8 different major forest fires in the middle of a drought, in the middle of COVID. Those environmental factors are affecting not only our public health as a collective, but our individual health, psychologically, emotionally, and physically. So this session today is a very important session for us to contemplate, because the environment and public health, that interface, will become increasingly central to human affairs worldwide in an increasingly powerful way. So that's our session today. But before we dive in to our dialogue, let us take a moment, as we always do, and let's just pause. Center yourself in your body, take a breath, and close your eyes. And place your attention on your heart. See if you can listen to your heartbeat just for a minute, in a spirit of gratitude and thanksgiving that you're alive. We're all alive at this most extraordinary moment in the human journey. Thank you, everyone. Now, with an open heart and a heart full of gratitude and love for each and every one of you joining our session today, I want to turn our program now over to David Somek of the Europe Health Future Forum and Lars Munter of the Nordic Health 2030 movement, who have been now curating now into their third program of health during a time of COVID for Humanity Rising. So David, Lars, thank you so much for everything that you've done to bring these issues to our collective attention. And I turn the program over to you.
Thanks, Jim, for inviting us to do these things. We're enjoying it very much. Lars, do you want to introduce this session?
Well, yes. And as some of you that have been with us, or these particular types of sessions, I know that a few of you probably have seen all 324 sessions, well, at least for our purposes, the sessions that David and I have curated, you'll remember perhaps that we actually started a lot of what we did with a video with a man standing in a forest and talking about the links between our nature, our exposome, to use a lofty word, and of course, our human body and our microbiome, indeed. The connection between the outside world, whether that be, well, bees or trees or other parts of nature, and our human health is, of course, essential to our well-being. It is, alas, also something that we forget at our peril. But today, again, we'll try to dive deeper into, well, sadly, probably not the fairy tale that we would like it to be, but at least a story that's very human, has some very well-known elements. And if we're a little bit lucky, at least we'll find a little bit of light on the horizon. I, as you may remember, am from Denmark. So Hans Christian Andersen's story about the girl with the tinder sticks is probably not one to use this phrase or this place in time, because of course, if you remember your stories, the girl dies. In this case, we would like perhaps a bit more positive outlook, and we'll see with our three speakers today if we can at least also ignite that little bit of hope as well.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. And just to explain the concept behind this particular, Lars and I would like to think that we have a holistic approach to health and the health ecosystem. But in terms of talking about the environment, we thought we should turn the thing upside down, really, and get three people who really know about the environment to talk to us about their view of health. So we're going to start with Caroline White. If you'd like to open your video, Caroline. Hi. Caroline is calling us from France, although she's Irish. She lives in Burgundy at the moment. And as we've done with these other fireside chats in this series, we're going to ask Caroline, in this case, to tell us a little bit about herself and where she's coming from, and then to talk to us about what she really cares about in terms of the environment and health. Caroline.
Thanks, David. Hello, everyone. Delighted to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me. My name is Caroline White, and I have a background in ecological economics, which is a kind of an unusual branch of economics, which puts the environment outside economics. The economy has to fit inside the environment, rather than treating the environment as something within economics that you can, within the economy, that you can dump things into and take things out of. So we see human life and the economy as embedded within a broader environment. And so I do research and advocacy for FASTA, which is a think tank based in Ireland, but with international membership. And it's the Foundation for the Economics of Sustainability. FASTA, the word FASTA, is actually the Irish language word for in the future. So we're very much focused on what changes can be brought about in the economy now to enable us all to have a good future. And as David mentioned, I'm actually from Ireland originally, but I've had the good luck to have had a chance to travel a fair bit. I've lived in California, I've lived in various different countries, and at the moment I'm living in rural France in Burgundy, which is a lovely place. I'm very fortunate to live here. And like a lot of people in FASTA, I'm very interested in systemic level change. So in other words, in identifying leverage points in the economy, things that could be changed that would have a hugely beneficial effect, things that have enormous effects kind of all over the place. You know, you make one small change in one area and it can have a huge effect elsewhere. And what's fascinating to me, and I'm sure to a lot of people here, is the links between the environment and health, and how a lot of things that are beneficial for the environment are also very beneficial for health. And I'm just going to very briefly touch on three things that I'm focusing on at the moment that I think would help to bring about the kind of systemic change that we need. At the moment, and Mike will probably speak about this too, we're involved in a project called Cap Global Carbon. And this is a framework which personally I think could be a real game changer for climate change and also for justice, for climate justice, because it's a way of mitigating climate change and also reducing poverty and inequality. And of course, as we all know, poverty and inequality have a huge impact on health. So all of these things, of course, are interconnected. And what this Cap Global Carbon Initiative would do is it would eliminate the use of the introduction of fossil fuel into the economy, like the extraction and the import of fossil fuel into countries globally over time. And it would also support climate justice. We would put a binding cap on the fossil fuel supply at source and then distribute carbon revenue as climate dividends. So effectively, it would ensure that the richer global north countries in the world are supporting the energy transition of the global south countries in a way that provides substantial climate finance. And I'm sure we'll be talking about it more later, but I'm also going to be at the COP conference in Glasgow, and that's going to be a big focus there for me. So I'm really looking forward to that. Second thing I wanted to mention quickly is that along with David, I'm also part of a core group that's helping to create a wellbeing economy hub on the island of Ireland, and that's part of the Global Wellbeing Economy Alliance, which is working to reorient the economy so it can meet humanity's need for sustainability and social justice. So we're working to change the narrative about the economy, about what we want the economy to do, what we think the economy is for, so that it supports regeneration. And later on, I'm sure this will come up again because this is a big focus and it's to do with narrative change, which is so important. And the final thing I'll just briefly mention is that I'm just about to start a research project, which will be on ways in which agriculture could be made more sustainable in Ireland and also elsewhere by easing the pressure that's being put on farmers to constantly try and expand their productivity to the detriment of the environment and health. And again, there are very strong links, of course, between food production and health and the environment. And I think others will be talking about this later too. So thank you very much.
Thank you. But actually, that was an amazing list of accomplishments in record speed as well, Caroline. But in all of what you do or are doing right now, would you say that you are actually busy using tools to create change, or are you more at the stage where you're building new tools to be able to do stuff? What are the level that we are at? Kindergarten or preschool or slowly getting into high school? Where are we?
That's an interesting way to look at it. To me, I think big tools that can be used have to do with the way things are framed, you know, narrative, the kind of visions you have about the economy. I think we all have, if you like, expectations or biases about the way things are in the world, the way people are and so on. And if we are clever, we can work around them. We can't escape them all the time, but if we're clever, we can work around them if we're aware of them as well. And I think using the power of narrative can help us to escape some of the biases we have, or some of the things that are making it harder to change, you know, making it harder to imagine that things could be done in a different way. So to me, that's a really important tool. And I think in a very practical level, things, just recognizing the connections between things like inequality and the extreme power inequalities that there are in the world now, the inequalities obviously of income, that has a huge effect on other kinds of inequality. And looking at that kind of thing and thinking about very practical ways to alleviate that, to reduce it. To me, that's an important tool. That's a systemic level thing that could have a lot of good effects elsewhere. And in terms of where we are, that's a really good question. I'm not sure. I think I wouldn't like to say, because I think it's tempting to kind of just be really cynical and say, oh, it's terrible, COVID has just shown how unequal everything is. It's even worse than it was now, and it's getting worse and so on. But the other thing is that sometimes things can shift quickly, and in a good way as well as in a bad way. So I don't want to draw too many conclusions about how things will be in the future just based on the recent past. So yeah, I'm a little unwilling to commit to a particular level of where we are, because I think things can change quickly. So.
Well, one would hope, as we needed. And of course, I guess you being Irish, storytelling comes natural. I guess you get an extra gene for storytelling in Ireland, maybe. But would you say, I mean, telling stories is of course one part of the equation. Would you also think that that people are listening more? I mean, there has to be some ears out there as well.
I think so. I'm being cautious here, but I think one of the sides of technology it's a really double-edged thing. Obviously, it has its negative sides and its positive sides. But I've felt like since the lockdowns, there's been a somewhat democratizing effect. It's not for everyone, obviously. Loads of people aren't online at all and they have no internet. But in terms of the kind of work that we're doing, it's much easier for us to attend meetings and to talk about what we believe in and so on when everything's online, and a lot of events are free, and you don't have to get to the place. And it's also a much lighter ecological footprint as well, to attend lots of different things. And I can't be sure again, but I do kind of feel like there's a little bit more ability perhaps to take in different points of view. Again, yeah, I have to be very tentative about this, but yeah, I don't think one should despair. I think there is things have changed a little bit. I also think, like a lot of people, I think that COVID has shown how quickly governments and individuals and communities can react when there's a real emergency and everyone knows it's an emergency. There can be a really quick change, and that's very interesting. I think it's something that could be used in other circumstances as well.
David?
Yes, just
you had the distinct, I want to say something.
Oh, you know me a little bit, Caroline. I just wondered, I think what you've been talking about with Lars is really important in terms of both the whole notion of dialogue and narrative, as a way of changing attitudes. But there is still a problem about just how much of an emergency people think they are. I mean, I can hear our politicians, for instance, talking about code red as if it's a stick to beat people with, but you wonder how serious they are really. But I was wondering, as an economist, as well as an environmentalist, I mean, thinking about, for example, that really interesting Cap Global Carbon initiative, are there also economic levers you think that might help move things along?
Absolutely, yes. To me, anything that would, I suppose, help to reduce the stresses on people to overconsume, overproduce, degrade the environment and so on is a good economic lever. I think, often when people talk about economic levers, they're talking about pricing of resources. And I think that can play a role, but you have to be really, really careful with it too, because, for example, carbon pricing can be very regressive if it's not very carefully handled, and you don't, you know, if you are able to redistribute the money from something like that in a fair way, that makes a big difference. But unfortunately, as we know, there are examples of places where that hasn't been done well at all, and there's been big problems, and understandably so. But I do think, yeah, absolutely, I think it's central that the economy is about how the household gets managed, how the planetary household gets managed. So it's got to do with fairness and making sure everybody gets what they need. And I really enjoy the donut economy idea of Kate Raworth. You may have, I'm sure a lot of people have heard of that. You know, it's kind of a playful idea. And as she says herself, it's kind of silly in a way, but the idea is that you would fit the economy into a donut so that the outer edge of the economy is enforcing, or you know, it's respecting environmental limits. So you aren't going through the outer edge of the donut, and then the inner edge is social needs. You know, all the things you need to have a good life. You know, adequate health, education, shelter, and all the rest, food. So we need the economy to fit into the donut. And the way Kate Raworth puts it is a dynamic balance within the donut. So it's not just a question of just sitting still in the donut. The economy is moving, things are happening, but it's in a nice kind of balance. And I like that idea, I like that metaphor too. I think balance is inherently kind of an enjoyable thing as well, finding a balance. And I think that's a good way to think about it. And the things I've been talking about just now, like cap global carbon and so on, they'd all tie very well into the donut, because cap global carbon, for example, it puts a hard limit on the supply of fossil fuel. So that's strengthening the outer part of the donut. And it also recycles revenue from the sale of permits for fossil fuel. And so that strengthens the inner part of the donut. So it works in both levels at once. And so all of these other things, I mean, in FASTA, we're involved with a lot of different things that we're hoping would strengthen both sides of the donut in that way. And so very much in the spirit of trying to redirect the economy so that the levers, as you say, David, are kind of gently nudging us into the donuts, you know, herding us into the donut. Maybe herd is a bad way to put it, but
fair enough. Yes, leverage with a light touch. Something. But yes. Okay, look, let's move on. Lars, would you like to introduce our second participant, contributor?
Well, I definitely like donuts. I do. And in this case, of course, I also, though, just for a short minute, the power actually here about, is it also sort of because Kate has found a nice narrative? Is that also why it works? I'm nudging you into saying storytelling works.
Storytelling works. Well, yeah, I would say, I mean, the way she puts it again is, and I like this, is this, well, I suppose there are two things. It's good to find a good word to describe something, obviously, you know, or the right word, like Confucius said, you know, having the right words are very important. Being careful with words is very important. That's one thing. And then another thing is that the power of visuals. And that is very, very interesting, I think, you know, our brains are programmed to take in visual stimuli very quickly, and so we have all these visuals about the economy that have to do with a very linear view, you know, and growth and all the rest. But if we replace those with other visuals, then that's really makes it much easier to produce a different narrative, you know, to find the words to describe where we want to go. So yeah, absolutely.
The power of the simple to enable an understanding of the complex.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, but without there's no pun intended actually to our next speaker, but let's, as David said, move on across the pond to the US. Certainly also a complex system, but again, to talk about environment, again, also a complex system. We're talking about a lot of complex systems with the complex systems. And yet we can all appreciate the beauty and simplicity of nature. Mike, in your work on the environment in the US, are you as either cautious or cautiously positive as Caroline?
Hi, thanks. Yes, hi, Lars and David and everyone here. My name is Mike Sandler, and I'm a trustee of FASTA and joined the group several years ago. I grew up in California, and I helped start a group there called the Climate Center. I've been involved in climate change and economics and a lot of the similar kinds of things Caroline was talking about, looking at systems and solutions. And that's kind of what drew me to work with FASTA. And FASTA works across a variety of different areas, as you kind of heard from Caroline: climate change, money, sustainability, food, water, and the commons are kind of some of the areas. And I think what ties in FASTA's work with what you guys are talking about with health is just the concept of a healthy planet and healthy people, and they go together, and you can't have healthy people on an unhealthy planet, right? And so I think the part that makes me not optimistic would be that I think we probably all agree that the planet is sick. I mean, that's part of what the donut economics and that sort of thing shows. They take scientific numbers from parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, or other environmental indicators, to show that there's problems in our biosphere and in terms of species extinction and other things like that. But in a health metaphor, if you're looking at all those symptoms, I mean, what's the diagnosis? And from the FASTA's perspective, we are looking at the economic system and capitalism and what we call the infinite growth imperative. So the idea that the economy has to always constantly be growing. And in politics, that's in the US, that would be a bipartisan issue. Everyone can agree, let's grow the economy. And if the economy shrinks, it's a catastrophe, and Congress has to step in and provide trillions of dollars to people. But that's where I get a little bit more optimistic, because now we're starting to take care of each other, and we are starting to realize that the economy can support the people that live on the planet. And so if you're doing quantitative easing to support the stock market and corporations, that's one thing. But if you're doing these economic supports to support people and to promote a concept of equality or equity, at least, that then that makes me more optimistic. And I think the Overton window, that what's politically possible, has shifted during the pandemic. Maybe not as far as we want it to go still, but people are talking about things like basic income. And that does make me more hopeful. And then people are also in their lives, in their daily lives, they're not commuting in their cars long distances as much during the pandemic. I mean, some people still are, but the traffic went way down here in Washington, D.C., where I live. And it's going back up again. You can see people are reverting back to their old habits. And we have to figure out what to do about public transit now, because they've taken a big hit during the pandemic. But some of those habits can get broken in a crisis. And I think that is a thing that I can be hopeful about, that we can maybe change some of those habits to be more sustainable. And then I just did want to add in two other things, if that's okay, that I wrote down in preparing for today's talk. One is about food systems, and the idea of food and health, I think, goes closely together. And I'm sure folks in this network follow that a lot, organic food and fewer pesticides. And in terms of the food system, we have kind of an unhealthy system. It's very fossil fuel oriented, and there's subsidies for these monocultures in the US. We have corn, soy, and meat also. And if those subsidies could be shifted over towards a more sustainable approach to taking care of the soil, and the soil has this ability to suck up carbon, and we could be having a more climate friendly food system that can also draw down some of the carbon out of the atmosphere. And then that relates back to personal health, I believe, in terms of heart disease and obesity and some of the things that are kind of the ongoing pandemics in the US. They pre-existed COVID, and they're going to keep going beyond COVID, is the number of people killed by heart disease. And they trace that back to poor dietary choices. But for some people, they don't have many choices if they live in a food desert and they don't have the option of getting organic food and that sort of thing. So those are the kind of systems that could be changed if we took a closer look at, what's actually causing the health impacts that we're seeing. And maybe we could do some economics approaches to shift subsidies and create, my last point here is something Caroline and I have been talking about, of maybe a farmer's basic income. So for food producers, they could have a basic income that would substitute for the subsidies that are focused on crops. And that provides a little more flexibility for them if they're facing climate change issues and they need to adapt and then shift away from monocultures, and the basic income would allow for that flexibility more than maybe a crop-based subsidy would. So just wanted to throw out all those ideas. I know, just like Caroline, that's a lot of things all at once, but those are kind of some of our ideas on health and economics and the planet.
Some very good ideas indeed. But what you're essentially saying that the planet is severely ill, but we're coming up with cures faster than it's killing us.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a race. It's like the sad part is, the rhinos and some of those charismatic beasts, they don't have a lot of time. We have to kind of save the ones we can, and with the people, there's folks on the lower end of economics and folks that are living in some areas of Louisiana or parts of the US that are hit. They're already feeling the impacts today. So it's not going to be one day where it all comes crashing down. I think there might be pieces that we see as we go through the 21st century, and we still have chance, though, to, I think, avert the worst impacts, and we do have a chance to kind of turn the boat, or whatever your metaphor is. We can move in a better direction. So I think it's definitely worth it. I think there are some folks out there, the doomers, they think it's too late, save yourselves, and I don't think that's the case. I think there are tipping points on the climate. It's going to get a little scary, but we have the ability to make changes, and the more changes we can make in a better direction, it'll help us, and it'll also help future generations.
I tried to get Caroline to say whether the I think maybe that I used the phrase of it was globally, but I alluded to her being based in Europe, whether we were in the kindergarten or slowly growing up. Would you say that you're at sort of the same stage in the US, or are you feeling? I'm not mentioning any names, but at one point, the US efforts to support the climate accord, the Paris Accord, was not particularly strong, but it's picking up again.
Yeah, I had a blog where I sort of mentioned something like what you're alluding to, but what I thought was interesting was that the younger people were the mature people in the conversation. People like Greta, who, when you hear her speak, she's very scientifically literate, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, from an environmental justice perspective, is bringing stuff to the conversation. For a while, she's the youngest congressperson in the US. Maybe there might be another person around her same age, but some of the younger leaders, I think, were being very mature in the conversation. And then you have some of the older leaders, no offense, everyone, but what like the person you were referencing previously, and maybe, CEOs of ExxonMobil, and then some of those folks are taking an opposite head in the sand approach to a lot of these issues, which I felt was very much, you're in denial, you're throwing a tantrum because your business model doesn't work anymore, those types of things. So I sort of felt like in the US, we were having this situation, it was flipped, where the younger folks were being very mature and having a future focus and looking at what kind of changes we can make, and major changes in society that don't scare them as much. And then, and it doesn't go across the board because there's some older politicians that I do support and stuff, but I was just kind of noticing that was kind of interesting that the status quo was being held on to in that way. And then some of the young leaders that aren't as bought into the status quo are open to more change.
Is this also, yes, sorry, David?
It's okay.
No?
I can wait. You can.
Well, yeah, I have just at least one more question to Mike, because here, what you also say about change, sticking your head in the sand, is this what change also looks like? I mean, some people, they need to stick their head in the sand for a while before change can happen. I mean, we would all like, I guess, transitions into a better world, that they would happen effortlessly and with beauty and grace and so on and so on. But maybe transition is always messy.
It's a good point in terms, especially in terms of what I'll bring it back to the mental health component of change, and that there are folks who feel safer in the denial space, right? Because this is pretty scary stuff, and especially if you've devoted a lot of your career in a way that maybe you'd have to reassess your career choices or your life choices. And so in terms of mental health, that would be difficult to do. There's people that have worked in the fossil fuel industry, and they're going to have to look at new career choices if we phase out fossil fuels in the next 20 to 30 years. People that worked in automobiles, and the basis of automobiles is changing before our eyes. Just in the next 5 years, I'm pretty sure electric vehicles will be the thing. And if you only deal with transmissions and combustion engines, what are you going to do in the future? So there's a lot of change coming down the road, and it is scary. And we do need to provide some mental health support for that shift and that transition. And FASTA did a mental health event that was helping some young people that were part of the Extinction Rebellion movement and facing burnout in just a short period of time. I mean, the kids kind of jumped into it full speed ahead, and then worked, and you're in a sprint, not a marathon. That can be difficult. So I think the mental health and the taking the long view and try not to burn ourselves out and kind of take care of ourselves along the way, I think that's important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that John Shari, who'll be following on, it might well mention that again, because I think this is an area that he's worked in specifically. But look, I'm conscious. I was talking to an American colleague earlier today, and I don't know why I'd never come across this as a particular. She was talking about BAU, which of course is business as usual, and it's what struck me about Caroline's comments, because, of course, on the one hand, there's the comfort of balance. On the other hand, there's also the comfort of keeping the status quo at all costs, because of the kind of anxiety that is actually normal. I mean, for people, it depends how fast change happens, but we have to accept some discomfort with change, even change for the better. But unfortunately for me, and I think many of us, the issue isn't just the discomfort of change, it's actually real vested interest and selfishness that demands that the status quo is maintained. The idea of losing power, losing income, and so on, that affects the people who are in power more than anyone else, not young people, unfortunately. But sorry, I don't want to make a little speech about this. More really, that's an long intro, typical of me. And by the way, we've been told off by one of our um, viewers in a nicest way, but they said, can you talk a bit slower? I think it's because we're all so fired up with this subject. We do tend to perhaps talk a bit fast, but we'll try. I said we'll try our best, but we get carried away. But look, these things you mentioned about agriculture to me are really striking. The thing about soy and so on. This is the over-industrialization to an nth degree, isn't it, of agriculture, and the extraction from the earth, the damaging extraction from the earth on the basis of an economic model. And however rational and sensible your argument against it, it's very hard to see why, once it's established, people would want to give it up, unless there's everything is obviously collapsing.
Yeah, so we have to make the case that the issue, one of the issues we have is there's specific special interests that support the current system, and they have their trade associations and folks that are walking the halls of Congress, as we speak. And the people we're trying to help are very broad. So basic income goes to everyone. And a farmer's basic income would go to all the farmers, but the small farmers, not necessarily Cargill or Archer Daniels, whatever they're called, the big conglomerates. I mean, we're looking for the small, the regular people is what we're trying to support. And they're very spread out and diffuse, and they don't have that political power. The good news is we can go anywhere and talk to any person about basic income. The bad news is we need to figure out how to get all those people together to make themselves heard in the halls of power. And that's one of the issues we come up against. And we're trying to figure out who's the right messenger, like Lars was saying, who can tell the story in a way that is believable and persuasive. And I felt like Greta was maybe the best example of a climate activist that I've seen in 20 years. And I don't know, no one could have predicted that 6 months earlier. She was a regular school student in Sweden, and suddenly she burst out on the scene. So hopefully we're going to have some more examples of that, and people that can tell the story and that can mobilize the people. And it is a populist kind of movement, but every so often you see these populist breakthroughs that can take on the entrenched special interests. That's what we're hoping for, I think.
Okay, look, that's food for thought indeed. So let's move on and include our final contributor, John Sharry.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, John. John is also based in Ireland, and you introduce yourself, John, and what really interests you here.
It's great to be here. I suppose I primarily introduce myself as I'm a mental health professional, primarily. That's what I've been doing all my life, over 35 years. Supporting families, children, young people, and adults with their mental health. And more recently, I've been involved with FASTA about 10 years or so. And really, I joined FASTA because I was becoming alarmed at the environmental crisis we were in, and trying to find some way, an organization I could join to support really constructive responses to that. And FASTA seemed a great one because it had that multi-systemic thing that Caroline's talking about, economics, Mike was talking about agriculture, and I'm talking about the system of the individual and community, or the mental health system, or the health system. So they all interrelate, they're all overlapping, and all solutions have to involve all those dimensions of people. And so that's what's very interesting to me, because it's a great topic for the talk to I was going to say tonight, but it's this afternoon in Ireland. It's tonight somewhere in the world, I'm sure. So I'm not totally wrong. Is health and the environment, because of course they're interrelated. Your health is dependent on a good environment, and when there's damage to the environment, it damages your health. I was very moved by Jim's opening talk there about, as we speak, there's this chronic stress in California because there ongoing environmental disaster. The fire is still raging, the drought is not ending, and that type of damage to people's mental health in that context, like a trauma that's occurring. And it's very important to acknowledge that. And then I was also very interested in the conversations, David, you and I had a couple of years back about when you were talking about the EHFF, the future of health. What would a sustainable health system look like? And that's what I suppose what I'm interested in. How can we build health so that people can be mobilized, people can feel nurtured in this declining world, I have to say. I know Lars is trying to help people be optimistic, but there's false optimism, I'm afraid, Lars, and reality. And you don't have to fear despair, by the way. Everyone thinks despair is a bad thing. I would really hope that many of the people ruling America would feel a bit of despair. That might help, because in a way you can get through despair to a genuine hope, but you have to go through a process. You have to embrace reality. You can't have a false optimism, and you're going to feel upset about it. Once you appreciate our collapsing world, you're going to feel trauma. Once you're going to feel a grief. There's a lot we can do, but there's a grief at all that's lost. Mike mentioned the rhino. The rhino's the tip of the iceberg, to say to speak, of all these little small creatures gone extinct, unsung and unnoticed, and so forth, and also communities and so forth. So as a mental health professional, the great thing is I'm not afraid of despair or emotion. So I help people journey through that, and that you can surf that to a better place. It's not the worst thing. The worst thing is being in unreality, sort of in denial, and so forth. But I try to envision what a sustainable health system would look like. It is about challenging narratives, Lars. I think that's very, very important, because there is a sort of narrative, and that's been presented through the COVID. If you look at the discussions, I'm less familiar with the discussions in the US, but I'm very familiar with the ones in Europe and in the UK and Ireland. And there's a presentation of health as a wonder thing, the health system, isn't it? It's how amazing it does all these great things. And that there's a truth to that. Like, it created a vaccine in Ireland. 95% of the population are vaccinated. It creates these incredible things as well. But there's not really then an understanding of what cost all those things are created as well, and the system behind that. It does all these great things like surgery and so forth, just to mention. These are all definitely great things, but they're not sustainable. Is in many ways is the issue, and these are one of these hard truths. Like, the current health system is extremely wasteful. If you look at all the even the creation of the vaccines. In terms of how it's created, in terms of the inequitable of the system as well. In the vaccine for some, but not for all, if you want to look at that. Health for some, but not all. And actually, the main people who benefit in some ways are the pharmaceutical companies who created them, and it's a big financial transfer. So there's problems with the health system in terms of how it's created as well, and how it's done. It's equally it doesn't solve many of the greatest problems we face in our health as well. The current modern industrial health system that is linked to economic growth. It's linked to economic growth. It requires increasing amounts of money into the health system for it to continue to expand. It's linked, very coupled with economic growth. And so forth, the way it's constructed, and it advantages some, but not everyone. It's inequitable, and so forth. So it's and it also doesn't solve some of the greatest problems we face, and it sometimes exacerbates them. Mental health is worse than it's ever been, despite the industrialization of pharmaceuticals for mental health. Obesity is a new problem that never existed before. Our chronic heart disease, these things are off the charts, and the health system has, and they cause more deaths than anything related to other than ever done before. So it doesn't do some of the basic problems. It creates more problems because this is on the health environment we live in. And then there's also the huge scandals. I was reading the opiate crisis in America, that the health system has killed 600,000. If you look at collectively, big pharma, which is in bed with health, has killed more people than the COVID pandemic through prescription of drugs that weren't needed, just because of industrial interests and so forth. It's not like a scandal around that. So so we need to be very critical of the dominant narrative of what the health system does and doesn't do, and then look for what is a more harmonious, sustainable creation of health in the world, and that's sustainable within limits, that's not dependent on economic growth, that's equal, that's accessible, that doesn't enrich big pharma and big doctors at the top, but actually empowers people to take care of themselves and their environment. And just to give you a little sort of salutary story about some of how this works and how you can solve many problems at once. Like most of the issues that causes disease and lack of health. I know Dave was saying one of the first workshops you did, Sean Conlon, I think, was out in the forest with his daughter as an example of health. In Ireland, one of the most innovative projects around mental health, you know, when somebody has very serious depression or anxiety related probably to climate as much as anything else and the traumatic world we're living in, you know, there's people can prescribe drugs for that or so forth. But there's also the awareness of how important nature is in healing mental health. And one of the groups I am involved in or is connected with is they take people who are in despair for whatever reason, and they go on nature walks. It's sort of walk and talk, if you like. So you reconnect with nature. And there's loads of evidence that reconnecting with nature improves mental health. Reconnecting with nature improves people's appreciation then of nature and helps them understand what the issue in the environment is as well. That's one of the biggest gifts that I've had in my 10-year journey when I woke up with alarm about the climate crisis and the environmental crisis is I got more involved with nature. I started growing food. I was fortunate enough to get involved in a forestry project to grow native woodland and to try to build ecosystems with groups of people. And that's the most joyous thing I've ever done in my whole life.
Which
John froze.
Very wonderful cliffhanger.
Mental health, and that is actually one of the most important is in terms of carbon capture, in terms of.
I think we have a slight challenge with your internet connection, John.
Creating food systems, and so where I'm going to leave it there.
Yeah, but well, actually, since we're talking about the link between the environment and health, I can now tell that I'm closer to despair, which is healthy, as you say, John. But I think maybe my point, though, about
but my point is, Lars, it's important to experience it. Your despair,
yes,
not be afraid
true.
of it.
But I think, though, in a more general sense, though, that knowing if we think about the environment, knowing what the cure might be, would give hope. As opposed to not knowing what the cure might be. And part of the cure might actually be to have a talk about despair, about the need for despair, about the need for a different realization about the mess we're in. But now that you're all here, if we look at this patient planet, not very patient though, it's very inpatient, but would it actually be good to prescribe some mental health sessions? I mean, and actually it's not just a joke. I'm sorry, but a few years ago, the Finnish presidency of the EU, they prescribed a course of AI for the entire continent. They wanted every citizen to be able to understand what AI might mean. Not necessarily because they had to be convinced that it was a wonderful thing, but they had to understand what it was before they could actually make any kind of informed choice. Could we make a mental health session for the planet? Sessions, I suppose there would be multiple.
But do you mean for society, not for the trees, presumably?
Yes, probably. Yes, we can. I think I definitely like trees, and I definitely also appreciate forest bathing as a concept. And hugging trees is probably also a good idea. But in this case, I was actually talking about, I mean, people resisting change. Maybe, as you sort of mentioned, Mike, and in a way you too, John, that there's a need for more focus on mental health, not just for individuals, but for society, for our culture.
Yeah, I think collectively, what I suppose one of the anomalies, or one of the myths or falsehoods, is the focusing mental health as an individual thing. You know, that's a sort of and not only an individual thing in our health system. The health system I'm critical of focuses as a biological thing. It's a brain thing that big pharma will sort out for you. You know, with an opiate or an antidepressant or something like that. When none of those are true to an extent, or they're only very minor aspects of mental health. Mental health is relational, so it's about good relationships with people you care for. It's an ability to have purpose as well, and to contribute to society and to meaningful work where you feel valued. It's about been able to make a difference in your community and being a good community member and a good community system. That's good mental health. It's being connected with nature and appreciating nature and enjoying nature. So a multi-dimensional aspect of mental health is definitely a good idea, and health, if you like, is really crucial to that.
I wanted to mention an angle in terms of climate communications. So climate change activists have had a really hard time talking to the public about climate change. And one of the questions is how serious do we need to be? How optimistic should we be? And I remember David was saying something about the Green New Deal. So they decided, politicians or someone decided, and environmental groups decided, let's talk about the Green New Deal and what are the metaphors associated with the Green New Deal. But it's more positive. We're going to do a lot of spending, infrastructure spending, but it'll help the climate. It won't address that underlying growth imperative or the function of capitalism. It's not going to address a lot of the inequities that we have in environmental justice. They're trying to put a few environmental justice components into the Green New Deal, but and people try to always focus on win-win solutions for climate, but sometimes it's not win-win. Sometimes you're like, hey, we need to save more habitat for the rhinos, and that's going to affect other things. And it's not win-win all the time. And it's not always very optimistic. Sometimes, like you said, there's serious issues and we have to be a little more serious. So we have to figure out how to communicate that to people without bumming them out too much. We still want them to be engaged. So we don't want people to withdraw, right? But we still want to be serious about it and not say, oh, no problem, we got this covered, because I don't think we do.
Caroline, what's your take on the Green Deal?
You see, I think it's a great question, Mike.
John, go on.
Yeah. I think maybe.
Sorry, it's a great question, Mike. About. Sorry, I'm sorry. My internet's coming and going. I must apologise. I hope you can. Can you still hear me? Can you?
Just now, yeah, it is breaking, but go on. Yeah, please, John. Yeah.
I think there's a tipping point now that's occurred that we need to be much more direct in communicating with people. That we're in a serious state. We're in a crisis. It's not going to go away. The drought's continuing. So, like, you're right about this fear about bumming people out, but they sort of know that's true, and then you have to tell them what's needed. There's no painless way through this, I think, is true as well. Like, it's not, the win-win. We can all rise together. We can all have the same. We can all give everyone a car is the answer. As opposed to there's a limited number, and how do we share out a finite world is the question. That's what basically Cap Global Carbon's about, isn't it? That I use a simple metaphor. Everyone gets one. It's not a good metaphor. There's only so many flights people can take. Let's say there's 20, and you have to, and you can sell your flight to the other person, or the other person can buy it, or whatever. That's the carbon credit. But there's a finite. So it's a really difficult concept. You'd have to bring in this narrative of war, rationing, and people ration things. They realized there was a limited amount. I don't think we can get away, because what will happen if we don't bring that narrative in, it's just going to happen anyway. All the systems will collapse and there won't be anything, you know, and people will be fighting over the last resources. So I think you have to speak straight to people about it.
John, let's ask Caroline what she thinks about the particular issue.
Sure. Well, I totally agree that we have to we shouldn't try to gloss over things or pretend things are going to be wonderful for, you know, in some kind of sense where everybody has a car or something like that. At the same time, I think, you know, when you talk about optimism or positive sides of things, there can be a lot of variation on exactly what that means. And one of the things I found really fascinating about COVID was all the surveys that were done showing that for most people, the most important things are good relationships, good health, you know, access to nature, that kind of thing. Being able to work a lot and make lots of money and have lots of stuff was very much secondary. And I think for a lot of people, it really confronted them with what's really essential and important to them. And to me, without meaning to gloss over anything or, you know, pretend there's going to be no suffering or anything like that. At the same time, I think there's a really fundamental positive side to living within particular limits. It doesn't have to be seen as something that's inherently negative. And the pain, even the process of pain and learning or in changing is also, it's kind of instinctual in a way. I think if you look at the way, talking about what level we're at, whether we're at kindergarten level or toddler level, you know, if you look at the way toddlers learn to walk, they start walking, they fall over, they hurt themselves, they do it again, they keep going. They don't lose hope because it's painful or because, you know, they don't lose motivation because it's difficult, and, you know, they just keep going. They know what they want, and they, you know, they work through the suffering. They're willing to work, they're motivated to do it. And I think, you know, we've all learned to walk, we've all learned to talk, which is also extremely difficult to do. And, you know, I think we all do have an inherent ability to cope with living within limits. And just to get back quickly to Kate Rayworth again, because I do enjoy the way she writes and thinks. One of the things she says is that limits, imposing particular limits like the environmental limits and so on, it triggers creativity in a certain way. Like if you're a designer or, you know, something like that, and you're just given a blank sheet of paper and you said, and they say, just do whatever you like, it's destabilizing. It's like, what can I, you know, you've no bearings, you've nothing to work against, you know. If you have some limits, if you have something that you can work with, then, you know, that gives you a frame of reference, and it makes it easier in a lot of ways to really come up with something that's positive and creative. And one other last thing about the rationing point as well is that one of the fascinating things about rationing, for example, in the Second World War, is how good it was for health. You know, how a lot of people who were, you know, in the lower income levels in the UK did really well in terms of their health during the World War II, because they had access to good quality food, and it just had a huge effect on things like childhood nutrition and that kind of thing. I find that really fascinating. So I think we are capable of working together and finding answers to these things. I think it's important not to frame it too much in terms of kind of absolute positives and absolute negatives, because something can be positive in one way and negative in another, and that's okay, you know. Though I also agree that going through grief and acknowledging sadness are absolutely vital as well. I don't mean to minimize that, but I think, yeah, it's not an absolute situation where it's just about pain either.
No, I think it's about reality, isn't it? I think it's a very profound point that John made. And I guess I was mulling it over while you were talking. But first of all, you know, if as Jim was touching on it right at the beginning about turbulence in society and how it's affecting everybody, the truth is that at the moment there's a risk within our society of people wanting to avoid discomfort at all costs. You know, people promote talking positively and all this as if it somehow will solve things, you know, and it's okay, you know, everything's going to be okay, you know, when in fact it's not okay. And part of that is about recognizing that life is painful. If we don't, you know, acknowledge that without being masochistic. You know, if we try and eliminate pain, we're in total denial about a lot of things. So it's accepting that you're going to have some discomfort, and that's all right, provided it's not extreme, isn't it? So I think that's really important. But what it made me think about was the environment and the relationship. One of the, and this is just, I don't know whether I'm right to frame it in this way, but one of the characteristics of the pre-industrial society and society relationship with nature was a degree of respect, because people knew they depended on nature to whether they thrived or not. You know, whether the crops were ruined, you know, there was no government to bail them out or anything. You know, it really mattered, and people weren't able to control nature, so they were fearful in respect of what nature might do, and that, I think, fostered an attitude which, of course, has completely disappeared now, because our culture is one of we can do anything, we can control everything, you know, which is essentially in the end false. But it permeates our attitude, I feel. It's just, I shouldn't be talking about my personal opinions, I should be listening to yours, but, you know, I do think it resonates for me, though.
Well, I'm glad you think so, David. But I would say that people that were using coal as a power source in the good old days, that they were not necessarily respectful of nature. But it depends.
I was talking about well before coal
the
as a source,
good old
when they were
days.
still growing, they were still burning turfs. You know,
yeah, but today apparently I'm staying a little bit in the looking at the planet as a patient. So it needs perhaps a few mental health lessons, and it also needs a diet, apparently. But as everyone that has tried to be on a diet will know, that's a challenge, continuous challenge, yet it can be done often, not probably without falling off the horse from time to time, but you get back on and you try again. If we stay in that mindset of thinking not necessarily about administrating drugs to solve our challenges, but at least thinking about treatments. Since we've normally talked about health, can we use some of the tools from the health sector to solve some of the environmental challenges? Thinking about treatments, thinking about diagnosis, thinking about not necessarily, again, not a pill, but and neither a blue pill nor a red pill, but at least thinking about ways that we can try to administer cures, or at least pathways to improvement.
An interesting question or metaphor, Lars. Like I'm caught up in the pill metaphor. Like I suppose the pill solution is the geoengineering of the climate fantasists. You know, that there's a simple, I guess, if you want to use that metaphor. You use also about the notion of going on a diet. And you're right, diets don't work, as all the research is, especially if there's a focus on them being restrictive, if they're sold as you're giving up something. What does work is changing the narrative. You're selling people health. You're telling what they were being fed was poison. The fast food, the corn syrups, they're killing them. And you want to rephrase to a new narrative. You're embracing a new healthy lifestyle. And that's a much more successful approach. Like we're involved in these health programs, healthy families programs, and focusing on health, small habits, small changes in food and in routines are really key to well-being. And it's all lifestyle issues. Like, interesting enough, like the overlap between stress is an issue. If people are more relaxed, they overlap with relationships, if they've good quality relationships with people. So a more positive selling, as Caroline's saying, it's not the pain, selling that there's loads of advantages to this other side of a better future, sustainable future, that you can sell as a positive thing in this way. It's a bit like you can either go on your holiday, take a plane and fly miles and miles away, or you can just go walk down the road to a beautiful park or to a field that's nearby and have just as good a holiday if you just perceive it differently, and you'd get to know your community better and so forth. And one doesn't involve a great destruction of the planet. And one
was a supportive community and peer support helpful? Yes. I know that someone once said that it takes a village to raise a child, and in this case, I wonder, of course, with the global village, whether we have what it takes to at least get our toddler off the ground and make him or her actually go through those growing pains and grow into perhaps an adulthood of some kind, with a more respectful attitude to using resources. I mean, if you've ever had teenagers, you know that they don't really think about where money comes from. They simply spend. So maybe I'm thinking that we are in high school at this stage, because it's definitely a teenager. But in this respect, I mean, what do you think, Caroline, or maybe Mike? Would there be a sort of a medical approach to take here? Thinking of I mean, what you do in FASTA, thinking about the economy, is that really about trying to figure out how to actually build your new diet? Suddenly,
Caroline,
everyone.
would you like to?
Yeah.
My
Sure,
neighbor
Mike, yeah.
is doing some landscaping out here, so it's a little noisy, I'm afraid. I don't know if it
It's
comes
not
through.
coming through, don't worry. Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, great. Well, yeah, I mean, in terms of putting the planet on a diet, like you said, I mean, a carbon diet for sure. We're looking at restricting that. The cap global carbon concept would have scientists set a cap on carbon emissions, and that would go back to fossil fuel use. And then there's this thing called the keep it in the ground movement. They try to keep fossil fuels in the ground. You know, and basically it's going to have impacts on our economic system, because there's countries and there's corporations whose value is based on them having access to these resources, and we're saying, no, you can't have it. So there's this tempting, you know, it's like having a tempting cookie and you're saying, sorry, you got to cut down over here before you can have that. So yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of things going on with that metaphor that you could maybe use. And you don't want to be scolding. If you know, one of the things in the US in the 2016 election, I think people felt like they didn't want to feel bad for their choices. They didn't want to be scolded. And, you know, maybe Donald Trump made them feel okay, like, hey, I can still make these choices and not have to confront consequences about, you know, and then eventually that catches up with you and you say, okay, maybe now I should do it. So it just depends when our culture or our country is going to be ready to make some of those changes, and not feel scolded, feel supported in the change, you know. So it takes a certain type of approach to do that. And we've been working on climate communication for a long time, and I don't think we've cracked the code. I wouldn't say that we're excellent at it. We are able to talk to very well-educated people and college-educated people pretty well, but I don't know if we're able to reach a broader segment of society. And we focus on science a lot, and that science communication only gets you this certain group of people. So we're still trying to work on that. The broader stories, I think, the universal stories, like you said, Lars, can maybe reach more.
I've tried multiple times to use science to explain stuff to my teenagers, and it never really worked. So So no, but staying perhaps also in the mindset of lifestyle changes rather than diet perhaps. But when you do that, you're also consciously aware that there will be pain. If you use that metaphor of a diet or a lifestyle change, you expect it to, not necessarily hurt per se, but at least you expect that there will be consequences of that action. And sometimes even when you go on a diet or try to change your habits, those consequences actually in a way makes you happy, because you can feel that the change is happening, that it's working, that you're doing something. Rather, I think maybe Caroline, you said it, trying to go for the win-win is a wrong concept. And instead we should appreciate the pain, because that means that we're doing something right.
Well,
right?
there's definitely going to be some sacrifice. I think we have to admit there will be some sacrifice. We also have a carrot out there. The carrot, there's the stick and the carrot. The carrot is a carbon dividend. We think if we return the money from a carbon price back to people as a dividend, and that could be like a basic income, we feel like that will help with the transition. It makes the carbon price less regressive. We feel like there's a lot of positives with the carbon dividend. So we are trying to push that, but you're right. It's a diffuse thing, and maybe people don't really trust they'll get it. In the US, the government sent out checks to people. They called them survival checks. And I thought that was really interesting framing of that. Some of the community groups called it survival checks. I didn't hear that from Congress, but they were calling them stimulus checks, which is about growing the economy or stimulating economic activity. And we're worried, okay, you're stimulating economic activity. That's the Keynesian approach to the economy. You want to stimulate the economy, but if all those activities are carbon intensive, then you still have a problem. So we're trying to decouple the carbon emissions from the economic activity and provide support for people with the basic income or carbon dividend. Hopefully we can get all those things into our little box and make that happen. So that's one of our goals.
Look,
I think maybe I've been the friendly GP for a while for Planet Patient. David.
Yeah, I was going to challenge you. Yes,
yeah.
Let me challenge the GP and say, okay, look, you're hitting us with the medical model, asking us to find solutions. Come on, guys. The health of the care of the health system of the future is about prevention, not about dealing with symptoms. And very interesting, we were talking about kindergartens and all this sort of stuff. This is about our kids, our grandkids in my case, and what do we do with them? How do we help them help the planet? It's because there are open minds there. By the time they get to teenage years, they want to throw off all the parental inhibitions and get on and do their own thing. But eventually they slow down after they had their period of madness, but if there's something ingrained in them from the parenting and the walking the talk that their carers gave them when they were really young, that surely can then make a difference. But it's a longer term plan, but it's happening in small places around the world. I think we talked about in a previous thing, we had a lovely presentation from Finland about how they were teaching mental health resilience in schools, for heaven's sake. Something that's really valuable, but they're a bit ahead of the game there, I think. But I was struck, as a grandparent the other day, at mealtime, my younger grandchild said to me, "Granddad, you're putting too much salt on your food," from a 10-year-old. I was impressed. She's obviously getting that from, whether it's from social media, from school, but these ideas are around and kids pick them up. you know, and it's really important for me, I feel, to foster this kind of thing, because that's actually the approach to health we should be thinking about, isn't it? Prevention rather than having to treat symptoms. But maybe it's too fanciful to apply that to the environment. I don't know if we're in code red, but maybe code red isn't quite as imminent as we think if we're determined to bring about change in society's attitude. I wonder what the panel thinks about that.
You go in, Caroline.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Caroline. Yeah.
I think it's really fascinating just to notice the similarities, the real synergies between health, you know, preventive approach to disease and illness, and a healing approach to the environment, and you know that they're both very much long-term, you know, strategies and ways of thinking about things. And I was on a webinar about health in Ireland. I think, David, you were at that too a couple of months ago. And I think for you, it was all very obvious because it's your field. But for me, it was fascinating because I really noticed how much our values were in common, the healthcare people and us environmentalists, you know, and the emphasis on early intervention, you know, getting, you know, dealing with problems early on and thinking in the long term was just so central to that. And another thing, one of the people who attended the panel, one of the panelists at that, who was a doctor, he made the point that you know, healthcare has moved on a lot in the last few decades in the industrialized countries. And in the past, it was more about acute illness. Of course, it still is to an extent, but nowadays there's more chronic illness. You know, there's things to do with lifestyle, you know, obesity, cancers to do with lifestyle, all of that kind of thing. And the importance of changing lifestyle and of you know, on focusing on prevention. And again, that's really ties in very strongly with the environmental aspects as well, you know, with the needs to change lifestyle, and the synergies between the two are just so strong. So I find it really fascinating. And I want to put in a good word for teenagers. I have a teenage daughter. I'm terribly proud of her, and she's persuaded us to get rid of our car. She's just really, I mean, Mike mentioned earlier that young people tend to be more able to imagine social change, or I don't know if you put it exactly that way, but it's easier to imagine big changes in society without feeling freaked out or destabilized when you're young, because you aren't as sort of entrenched in thinking about things a certain way. And I think that's a very healthy thing. It's very important to be able to listen to that and think about it, I think. And also for them, the existential side of the environment is very visceral. You know, that's why Greta, she speaks with such power. And to me, I'm terribly proud of the young people who do that. I also feel a lot of grief myself that we haven't dealt with this ourselves, you know. But anyway, I'll pass it on to somebody else now. Thanks.
John, I think you had a comment too.
Yeah, no, I agree with what's been said there. The communication is where, you know, people can feel somehow you're highlighting their poor choices and point of view. Nor does it work from a health point of view when you're communicating with people around these issues. So it's really, I think the way we found from a health point of view when I'm working and promoting health in families, it's not individual choice that's causing the problem. That's the first thing. How come everybody is not sleeping? How come everybody has chronic heart disease? How come everybody's overweight? Are people now somehow more stupid than they were 20 years ago? No, it's the fact that the environment created by the national food producers, they put sugars in everything. They put sugar because they know that's an addictive substance, and they campaign to change legislation so that they can get all their foods cheap, malnourishing foods into people's mouths. That's an environmental thing, and in psychology, we're all just products of the environment. Nobody has the willpower. If I put a cream cake in front of you, Lars, that we mentioned the donut earlier, if I put 3 donuts in front of you, you're going to eat them, Lars. If I put an apple in front, it might be a matter of time, you eventually will cave and you'll eat them. If I put 3 apples in front of you, you'll eat them as well, because it's just what's the choice in front of you. So I think system change is where it's at. And it's the vested systems always change the dynamics. It's like that it's all individual choice. No, it's not. All the evidence shows that the cigarettes aren't there. People won't smoke them. With cars, with all those, with holidays, if Ryanair aren't pushing flights, people won't fly. Pushing it out that there's a great holiday to fly to a burnt out island over there and get cancer in the sun. I'm selling it a bit more the way they don't, rather than going to your beautiful own country down the road. That would be a much better. But nobody's selling properly the alternative lifestyle. So it's the environment is the problem. It's the environment that we need to create of food and health. So system change is what's needed. There's no question about it. And always the big vested interest always trick it into its individual choice. The individual choice, and it is
system change is needed.
System change.
For sure.
If cap global carbon was implemented, the first people to lose are all the fossil fuel industries, are all the aviation industries. They're to be scared. But then all the people to gain are all the poor people. That suddenly all the money would be, the wealth would be distributed. So they're going to fight like hell to stop that.
And another systems change that we definitely need, John, and thank you very much. It's about time for David and I to retire for the day and hand over the reins to our friendly hosts, Jim. And speaking about systems changes, our audience will have noticed that today I've been the family physician with a fairly bleak outlook, whereas David has been the positive, looking for the future, and the grandchildren, sparking a hope for the future.
It's often the other way around, yeah. But look, we've had three very passionate contributors. We're really grateful, but we are, as Lars says, we're bound by the tyranny of the clock. So, although that's no disrespect to you, Jim, so welcome back. So we gratefully hand over to you now. Thanks for the opportunity for us all to exchange our ideas.
It was certainly a pleasure to talk about the environment again.
Well, thank you, Lars and David and John, Carolyn, Mike. This has been, I think, one of the more important sessions, and I'd like to make a couple of comments. First, just to underscore what Lars just said about, sometimes he's the more pessimistic one, and sometimes it's David. And I think we're in one of these situations where our optimism and our pessimism shifts, from day to day or situation to situation, and sometimes we feel both simultaneously. We're in such a complex reality right now where the external environment and our inner environment are interpenetrating one another in an equilibrium that is always in flux. And I think that's one of the reasons why the stress levels are going up, because it's no longer possible to keep the external environment away from our inner sanctum. And the second comment that I want to make is I wanted to really appreciate, John, what you were bringing in, because I think we're in a situation where optimism can be naive in the face of reality. And what I mean by this is that you may remember back in June, there was an article in Arctic News, and a group of scientists are now predicting that by 2026, we're going to have an extinction event on planet Earth, that the climate is now spun so far out of equilibrium that the hit that's going to come within the next several years is going to knock us down with a force that will dwarf the impact of COVID. That's what Code Red means. In the aftermath of that piece, and I would recommend it to everybody to read it, it kind of shook my world, because in 2020, we were all thinking we had 10 years. And the Secretary General and a lot of climate people were saying this is the most consequential decade in history, and we have till 2030. And what's now emerging is we don't have till 2030. We've got till maybe 24, 25, 26 to get it together, or we're going to take some hits that will literally deconstruct civilization as we know it. And I think this is important to take in because in the aftermath of the Arctic news piece, many, many climate scientists from all over the world came out saying, we apologize because we've been so diplomatic for so long. We actually haven't been telling the truth about what we know because we think that we need to be polite so people don't get upset. But we've now come into that moment where ongoing politeness is actually a disservice. And within that context, I just wanted to add one final note about the studies and recommendations that were done in the 1960s and 1970s. The first kind of official warning came in 1965 and was actually delivered to the White House to President Johnson, saying that climate change was an important issue and that it needed to be taken care of then. And he put it in the drawer and it was never heard of again. And then in 1972, a group of scientists from MIT, Club of Rome, and other related groups wrote another report saying that climate change, if we don't deal with it by about the first quarter of the 21st century, till about the middle of the 20th century, we could destroy civilization as we know it. We are now in that moment, in my view, and in the view of thousands of climate scientists, particularly when you factor in the massive releases of methane that are going on around the planet right now. And I would just urge all of you just to start Googling the methane releases that are going on. They're spawning. So it's not just the Siberia. And, you know, the Siberia has been in a permanent fire for the last year, year and a half, where the permafrost is just burning. And all that methane that's been buried for millions of years is being released into the environment. They did studies just last week off the coast of Washington State and Alaska. And there's now methane bubbles that are just appearing at rates that are staggering, that we're actually challenging the instruments that were being used to measure them. And never before in planetary history, never in 4.5 billion years of planetary history has so much CO2 been released into the environment in such a short period of time. If you go back to the Ecocene or the Permian, where they had 90% of the species wiped out due to CO2 and methane destabilization, those destabilizations happened over, over tens of thousands of years. And we're doing more CO2 in about 75, 100, 150, 200 years, depending on how far back you want to go. So we need to take in my view, that code red means that the human race is now not on the precipice. We're going over the precipice. And that's why the Secretary General said just last week, after calling it code red after the IPCC report in August, he said, we are now on a catastrophic pathway. Catastrophic. And that means that I think we have to look that reality ruthlessly in the eye and make our judgments as to what to do commensurate with the actual reality. I think Humanity Rising is certainly taking that point of view. That's why we've had Lars and David on to talk about health, because in our view, the issue of health, public health, personal health, in the face of not only the pandemic, but all the ecological turbulence that's going on around the world is one of the most consequential issues of our time. And we can't keep thinking, well, we'll just keep doing what we have been doing all along and kind of hope that the world will evolve, I guess, in a way that will maintain stability, because we haven't taken those steps collectively. And I don't think there's any reason to believe that COP26 will be any different. Such are the vested interests that are committed to arranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. And so how the movement, and I want to make a final point, because I think this is a challenge to us, because if you look at the last 75 years, the environmental movement hasn't made much of a difference. Because in the last 50 years, since 1971, according to the World Wildlife Fund, human activity has wiped out 69%. That's over 2/3 of all the biodiversity on planet Earth. The mammals, the fish, the birds, the insects, wiped out. Natural habitats, wiped out. Forests, wiped out. So we're entering into the code red with an ecosystem that has been so fractured, it's no longer possible to be sustainable. So the one option that we've got left is regeneration. Somehow we've got to proactively regenerate, and that requires that, in my view, that the climate movement needs to come together at a higher level of coherence. And I want to just take a moment, then I'd like all of you to respond, because I know that I'm taking a very strong position and we're going to go a little bit over today, but I think it's crucial that we have this conversation with people of your caliber. As the world now spins out of control at an accelerated rate, the climate movement needs to reach a higher coherence of collaboration at a rate proportional to the climate spin out, or else there's no energetic equilibrium that can create a global network that can withstand the hits that are coming. Because our governments aren't doing what is necessary. COP, in all probability, won't do much. But that's not stopping the spin out of the climate system. So as I look around the world, the only place that I can see that can actually make any difference is the climate movement, having worked basically individually over the last 40, 50 years, not having very much of an effect. So the question that we have to really delve into, and this is what we're going to do during the COP, we're going to have 12 days where we're going to be bringing the climate movement, both people that are global, but also the people that are there at the COP, the Conference of Parties between November 1 and November 12th, to really ask ourselves the question, how do we respond to this situation in a way that's both ruthlessly realistic, but is contributive to waking people up at the level that needs to happen in order for us to collectively make the now radical changes that are required to save civilization in some semblance of abundance. So I realize that this is a stark ending to this particular session, but having teased up this issue, Lars and David, I think it warrants us taking some real time, because I don't know of any other issue that even begins to approximate the gravity of what we're talking about today. And I know, Mike, you take a more, I would say, moderate view on these matters, but more and more people that are observing this are getting increasingly now concerned, given the rising turbulence of the ecology. So let's maybe just do, I know we don't have a lot of time, but if you just take a minute or two, maybe let's start with you, Carolyn, then John, then Mike, then David, then Lars, as you're appearing on my screen. And just let's have final comments, and then we can close out. But I really want to salute you for this conversation today. It could not be more important. Carolyn?
Well, thank you. I think it's really important to look this at this squarely, as you say, and even though it's very, very scary in a lot of ways. For me, the reason that we're going to be at the COP isn't because we think it's going to be fundamentally a transformation in itself. We're more there to talk to people in other NGOs and to make connections. And for us, the important thing is to focus on real tangible change that will bring emissions down in the short term, which is what we're talking about when we talk about capping fossil fuel. It's a real thing. Fossil fuel is 90% more or less of greenhouse gas emissions. There are others, but it's a huge amount. You know, methane, of course, is important too, as you say. But you know, focusing on the nitty gritty of actually how are we going to do this? You know, we're going to go upstream and we're going to do this from the source. You know, not just try and stamp out individual emissions all over the place, which is just, you know, impossible to do. It's impossible to track, and it's just too complicated, and we haven't enough time. So that's part of it. And then the other side is the social part, and the need to make a social connection and to emphasize, to find ways to reduce inequality, to reduce poverty, to improve justice, all of these things. The more empowered people are, the more likely they are to be able to, I suppose, to find that dynamic balance that we were talking about and earlier. And yes, it's a very scary time. But I think for me, I'm one of the privileged people who's had a relatively privileged life, and I don't want to throw away that luck. I want to use it as best I can, and in the time that we have. So, you know, I can only do what I can, but I feel like it's important to try and connect with other groups that are working and to establish common values and try and find that dynamic balance.
Yeah. I think that's crucial. We call it radical collaboration. You know, how do we just get together, all of us, in a higher strategic formation? So thank you for that. John?
Yeah, no, like I share some of your fears there, Jim. You know, in my background is science. I was a physicist for my first degree, so science is just very clear, you know, about the challenges and what they're coming. And then I'm also a human trying to deal with that experience, and a parent. And how do we live in the face of this reality? I suppose I think of this, it's existential reality, and what do we want to do in the face of it? And how do we want to live in the face of it? The work that inspires me most in that area, I've just put them into the chat, is the work of deep adaptation by Jem Bendel. I don't know if you know his work, Jim.
Yes.
And there's some lovely, and he's a great community creation as well, of people worried about and how they come together and how they support one another to make the best choices, different choices in the face of that. And he's a lovely summary of that, the 4 R's, you know, that of the best ways you can respond. So of the first R is I mightn't get them all right here, is resilience. What can we build to give us resilience to what's coming in our communities? Second R is like restoration. What can we restore in our environment that will help? And that could be things like nature, restoring ecosystems, restoring community. And then what can we relinquish? What do we not need that's just making things worse? Do we need the cars? Do we need to eat these foods from around the world of no benefit? Do we need all those things? We don't, is the answer to that, what we relinquish. And then the final reconciliation. Who can we reconcile with given what's happening? And even though the news is stark, the points of not optimum points of hope for me is that it makes me live each day as a precious moment of being alive. Every choice I make is important, and I try to think and deliberate and appreciate it. There's a small gift in the face of a very difficult existential reality, of which there are things you can do to make it better collectively. We don't know. The game is still playing. You know, the game is still, we don't know exactly how the future will pan out. So we must all collectively make our best choices. But I do suggest people to seek support. That's why I put those things there. If you feel upset about this, don't be alone in that feeling upset. Reach out to people in this. There's loads of people. I've had many a night, dark night of the soul about this, and I've had many things of trying to talk to people about it and emptying the room, you know, at a party, you know, where I talk about this and they all think, they all just drift apart. They used to bring me in to empty the pub in Irish pubs, you know, just to get everyone home. Just mention I'm going to talk about climate change and how you're all going to die very soon, and that would be the end of that. So, but then as in the dark night of the soul, to quote Saint John of the Cross, are the great Spanish philosopher Unamuno as well, is in, you know, the darkest hour is just before the dawn. So I think you can go through despair and there is a life to be lived beyond it.
Yeah, beautifully put. Every choice matters now. Every choice matters.
That's for sure, Jim.
No matter large or small. Yeah. Thank you so much. Mike.
And we talk a lot about solutions. I mean, we mentioned maybe threats to the biosphere and things like that, but we don't dwell too much on the problems because it can be paralyzing or induce panic for folks if they don't have a solution to turn to. And just changing out a light bulb in your house is not big enough to make a difference. I mean, it's good. I'm not saying don't do it, but we're talking about systems and we want to address systems and economic systems, really. And that's been hard to do. And a lot of environmentalists are very touchy-feely, don't necessarily go towards the economics of the situation. And we're trying to make it easy. So we say, let's put a price on carbon and return the revenues back to people. That's the solution we're promoting. And we call it Cap Global Carbon. And we're hoping at COP26 that Cap Global Carbon could be a solution then, and whether it fits into the UNFCCC approach, the COP Paris Accord, we don't really care if it does or not. We want to have individuals, groups, eventually countries to sign on to Cap Global Carbon. And we'd like to have balance between the global north and the global south, and provide a global equity framework. And we think you cap global carbon and you reduce it over time, and the permits provide the value and return the value back to the people. And I think that's a strong enough solution to counter some of the doom and gloom and difficulties with the biosphere. You're going to be getting money, and you don't necessarily need to grow just the climate movement. You can address any person from wherever they are. What would you do? Andrew Yang said, what would you do with $1,000 if you got $1,000 today? What could that help you solve in your life, the scarcity problems in our society? So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Well, thank you. And there's no doubt that the best way to combat evil is to make energetic progress in the good. And that's what you're doing. So I appreciate that. David?
Yeah, it's always difficult to follow on after all these wise words. I absolutely agree with Jim's opening comment, though, about all of this. I'm struck by the analogy with the country's response to the pandemic, and it was mirrored both in the European Commission and their discussions, you know, with all the member states of Europe, and also in the World Health Organization, which is the message was, if we're going to really hit this thing, it's through solidarity. It's the whole notion Now, they didn't really achieve it that well, and especially not that divide between, although they're now claiming they're doing it retrospectively, between the rich and the poorer nations of the world, you know, where the rich were hoarding vaccines and so on. But the truth is, it's common sense in a way that the huge challenge, I mean, I'm telling the obvious, is if we understand that getting coherence, as Jim put it, getting that connectedness of purpose between the groups that actually all believe very similar things, but aren't used to working as a group, you know, as a larger entity. That's the challenge, and it's been a challenge for long term, but it's time now. There's a pressing need to tackle that challenge and get that coherence in order to help change the system. And how we do it, well, we're all focusing on that at the moment, aren't we? But I think it's really where the answer might lie.
Thank you, David. Lars?
I think it's important to realize that the COP is a solution that we've bought in the TV shop. It does a lot of promises, but it's not really actually effective. It's not fit for purpose. And while it would be wonderful that it could actually chop and dice and do all the stuff that it says in the TV shop, it doesn't. So instead, the solution probably lies in firing up social movements, especially among the young. Yep. Caroline's daughter and other good youngsters out there, they are the solution. They are the pressure that we are unable, it seems, to apply. So doing our best to support them, because they seem to get their act together better than we do. And to do our best to actually get them to fight for that cause, not by necessarily by them solving it for us, but us helping them so they can make that pressure cooker actually work. The TV shop we bought, that doesn't work.
Well, I think you're making a profound final point, Lars. It's around the young. They get it. There was a poll just last week by the Pew Foundation. I think it was in 75 countries around the world, and the young people totally get the climate crisis, and they know what to do. They're ready to lead. We just need to empower them, and that's one of the fundamental impulses of all the groups, now over 400 that have been coming together through Humanity Rising to now establish the Global Regeneration Corps. It's really about empowering a multi-generational sort of pod formation, but focused on young people. They're going to have to live through what's coming. So they need to be empowered in a very, very intentional way with the kind of training that they need to not only navigate hypercomplexity, but to solve problems in the midst of turbulence. And that's not an easy thing to even think about, let alone really prepare for. But the Global Regeneration Corps is taking that on. So, well, thank you, everyone. This has been a rich and multi-layered discussion. Lars, David, you guys are the best, man. You guys are the best. And then tomorrow, everyone, will turn to the topic of peace building in our time, which is hosted by the Peace Action Lab that is emerged out of Humanity Rising. So we'll see you same time, same station tomorrow. Bye for now. Thanks, everyone.